Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the final in the series of in vivo webinars. My name's Emily Sena. I'm a preclinical meta-research scientist at the University of Edinburgh and have been hosting these series. This is part of the work that the BNA is doing to strengthen the credibility in neuroscience, and we're very grateful for the support from the Gatsby Foundation. So the format of these series, they are short lunch, we call them lunch boxes, so feel free to eat your lunch while it's happening. They're short, we have short 10 to 15 minute presentations, and we leave the rest of the time available for questions. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. You can use the chat box for general conversation, but if you put your questions in the Q&A box, then I'll make sure that I will get through as many of them as I can once the speaker has finished. The webinar will be recorded, and along with other webinars in this series will be made available on the BNA's Credibility Neuroscience website. So I highly encourage you to go back and have a look at some of the previous talks if you haven't been able to. I've learned lots, I found them very interesting. The current series has been very practical with tips to help with strengthening the credibility of your work. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Matt Grubb. Matt has had a career of moving around, which seems quite exciting. Did his PhD in Oxford, physiology, mouse visual system, I believe, in vivo electrophysiology, and then done a couple of postdocs, one in Paris, and then one at King's College London, and is now a group leader at King's College at the Centre for Developmental Neurobiology, and has had his lab for the last 12 years. I won't go on because I think we want to get to what Matt's talking about, but I just want to say that I think we're very lucky. Matt's clearly a very firm supporter of open science and data sharing, and actually won this year's BNA Individual Researcher Credibility Award. So congratulations for that, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you for
very
speaking.
Lucky to get that. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, Emily, for the introduction, and thanks to the BNA for the invitation. We share here. Can we see everything there, Emily?
Perfect.
Wonderful. And we've got the pointer up as well. Okay. So the title is Sharing Data from Your In Vivo Studies. And yeah, like Emily said, I'm going to chat for maybe 10, 15 minutes, hopefully no longer than that. And then we've got plenty of time for questions. What I'll say straight away is that this is a highly personal account of my experience and my lab's experience of sharing our data. So I don't pretend to have all the answers. I certainly don't pretend to be an expert on data sharing or on the, the kind of academic worth of it, or on maybe many of the arguments for and against, but it's definitely something we do. And I just want to tell you guys a little bit about why we do it and how we do it. And maybe answer some questions to give some tips as well. This is an in vivo seminar, and yes, we have in the past, and we do still, we work in vivo sometimes. We do some ex vivo work too. We do share in vivo data, but this is absolutely not limited to in vivo data. So I think I'll try and touch on a few of the cases where there might be some special considerations for sharing in vivo stuff. But basically, we share everything we can. And I don't think this is massively limited to, or in any way particularly specialized to in vivo data, at least not in our case, but it might be for other people's. The other thing to say is that there's just huge amounts of appreciation here, and thanks to others who lead the way, who led the way in the open science movement and being really vociferous and advocating for open science. I've really, I've really gone on board with a lot of that stuff, but I definitely don't count myself as a leader in these kind of things. So I really, want to thank, loads and loads of people, especially like the UK Reproducibility Network, other organizations, including the BNA, who are working really hard to try and make science and neuroscience in particular as credible, reproducible as possible. And you can go to the website that the BNA have got there. And actually, we just heard when we were chatting before the seminar, there are now some bursaries that you can apply to try and get a little bit of funding to attend credibility or sort of pro credibility events. So go and check those out on that website. what we do in the lab, we think open science is really important. We think it's important to be as open as we possibly can about what we're doing. And we do that in lots of different ways. And one of the main ways is that we make sure our publications are open access. And I don't think that's anything new. I think that's what most people are trying to do these days. We try and preprint what we're doing. So as soon as we've got things ready and we think they're, in a fit state to be seen by other people, then at that point we try and get them out there as preprints. And again, I think that's becoming more and more the norm for lots of people. I think maybe what's not quite so standard, certainly in particular subfields of neuroscience, is to share the data that goes into that work. So that's one thing that we try very hard to do. And we try and make all of the raw data that we've used to produce a particular paper available freely to people who want to use it. Okay, so why do we do that? So I think there's a very kind of practical and very selfish reason. I mean, I think even if you weren't thinking about anyone else in this process, I think there would be a very good argument for having a very kind of simple way, I guess, of having your data long-term secure and accessible. So the fact that we have our raw data from publications online on free to access repositories actually, paradoxically makes it easier for me to access our own data. The number of times I've actually, not bothered to sift through hard drives or other people's folders or computers on microscopes or anything else. I know I can just go to a website or a link and actually download the data that I want to get, that's our data that I want to have another look at, or analysis code that I want to make sure was the one we used in the paper and not the 48 versions I've got in the different folders on my laptop. I can do that, and we've been doing that regularly, and it's also very good to know that it's secure and properly backed up. I mean, I know there's lots of ways of ensuring that with your data, but this is another one. You're kind of leaving it to someone else who knows what they're doing to ensure that your data are very, very safe. There's a chance that you can get extra credit. So again, being really selfish, if you've created data sets and then published them, you get a DOI, a digital object identifier, that goes along with that data set. And then they can be cited, and they can form the basis for not just citations, but for positive points on applications for things. It's an extra thing that you've generated in terms of the outputs from your research, and I think that can be really useful. It's becoming more and more recognized. Certainly, all the grants these days are asking for data sharing plans, and if you can say, well, I do it already, this is how I do it, and this is how it's worked out, and this is the link that you can go and check it out, that makes that all the more strong. This is the main one for me. I think this is the main reason why I want to share data, is because I really would like it to be useful to other people, and you hope that you've gone to the trouble of collecting lots of data, that they're not, hopefully, only useful for their tiny little corner of science that you used them for, that you saw fit to use them for, and that maybe there might be all kinds of other things that interested and very clever people might be able to rework them into, maybe years, maybe decades in the future, and use them maybe in a combined sense with lots of other data sets, or maybe just as direct interrogations to bring up something that you'd never thought of before. And I have to say, I'm still waiting for that to happen from our data. I haven't seen anyone do that with us. I know loads of people have done it with other publicly available data sets, and it's wonderful to see that happen. And I think really that's the main reason. This is just an example from some in vivo data of the kind of interesting things that you can discover when you've got freely available data. Not our data, these were data from the Allen Brain Institute, who've done a great job in really normalizing and promoting data sharing, particularly of in vivo stuff. And this guy at the Champollion in Lisbon grabbed some of the Allen Brain Atlas data on neuronal recordings from different parts of the brain. And he noticed that there were timestamps on it, so he knew exactly when those recordings had taken place, like which day, what hour. And he just decided to see whether you could find neurons in different bits of the mouse brain which just happened to be tuned to funky stuff. And the one that he looked at was actually cryptocurrency. So you could follow cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and other cryptocurrency modulations in time, link it to the time at which the recordings took place. And surprise, surprise, you get neurons in different bits of the mouse brain that appear to be tuned to fluctuations in Bitcoin. This is a cautionary tale, right? This is one of these where correlation does not mean causation. It doesn't mean they're representing these things. And it's actually really interesting. There were loads of these, like a third of the recordings or something seem to follow changes in cryptocurrency prices. And just a kind of cautionary tale about when you've got long-term fluctuations in things, they can often co-correlate without there obviously being any direct link between them. So I thought that was a really interesting use of shared data. And the other one is I have to say, for me, I mean, I see myself as a scientist who's trying to do things for, I guess, as a communal effort. We've essentially been given money to do particular experiments. I always feel like it's not necessarily our own data anyway. I don't have a problem putting it out there. And in actual fact, I feel a lot better when you've kind of got it all off your chest. You're like, there it all is. We did this, there it is, you can check it, you can use it, you can do whatever you want with it. Makes me feel like we've kind of wrapped it up and completed it as a project, far more than actually just publishing a paper. Okay, downsides. Okay, you hear these quite a lot from different people, and I've kind of considered some of these. Some of them I think are more important than others. This is one that really seems to come through a lot, as people are worried about, well, if you put your data up there, then aren't people going to then use them to do stuff that's going to scoop you? I think really it's rather uncommon for people to share data before things have been published, or at least before things have been pre-printed. So basically at that stage, you've got your story, or the main story that you want to get out from those data. And you've started getting it published. So I would hope, anyway, if you've pre-printed it and published the data, you've staked your claim on the primacy of those results in the first place already anyway. I find it pretty unlikely that anybody's going to come along and scoop you on that exact study that you've already done using your data. Might they then go on and use those data and do some other interesting things which maybe you could have done? Potentially, I think, but at that point I think, well, already that's good, because they're interested in really interesting questions that you're also interested in. They probably won't be doing exactly the same things, because we all see data in different ways and projects in different ways. It's probably just useful, convergent analyses for the field at that point, I would hope. So that's certainly not something that unduly worries me, and it's certainly not anything that's ever happened to us as a result of sharing our data. The other one that people worry about, and I've seen this in some places, that people are worried, well, what if people come along and then they take our data, and then what they find with the data is not what we found with the data, and then they say that we were wrong. And I think, well, actually, isn't that how science is supposed to work? That's exactly the kind of thing that should be happening. And I would hope that it wouldn't get to the point where people say, well, actually, Matt, this entire study was absolute rubbish. If it was, then that's great, because I want to know that. And I want to go back and I want to check what we've done, and I want to know whether we need to, deal with that, possibly even retract the paper. And at that point, that's a crucial thing to know. But even regardless of that, even if it's not that strong, if people are saying, well, we've looked at your data and actually it might suggest this instead, I think that's just a really useful way for science to move forward. And then you can take those interpretations and include them in your future work. So I'm fully on board with that. I don't see that as a big issue. One issue that's kind of worried me recently is just the cost in terms of energy, in terms of storing all this data. And if you're thinking about in vivo studies, then dumping things on servers here, and does not come carbon free. Let's put it that way. And I think that is a consideration, and that is something, there's a big chat, and there was a bit of a Twitter discussion this week about, exactly how much should be shared for how long, and what the environmental impact of that might be. I think one consideration here, though, is, well, those data are going to be stored somewhere. They're going to be on a hard drive somewhere, or on cloud systems somewhere. Because you're going to be looking after them as a kind of data custodian. So at that point, they might as well be somewhere that's well looked after, that is in the public domain, and that other people can use. That's at least my view on it. And also, I think if you really care about these things, you can try and find data servers that are more environmentally friendly than other ones might be. I think the big issue, though, is that this undoubtedly takes time. It's not an easy thing to do. It can cost money to do in terms of the time and the effort, and sometimes the storage itself. But yeah, it's definitely not something that just kind of falls naturally out of having done the work. You have to put the time and the effort and the money into actively getting your data ready to be shared. And I think that's a consideration that needs to be held in mind. Where can you share stuff? Well, there are places where if you've got particular data, then you're going to be expected to share in these places, like a lot of the genomic stuff. I mean, it's wonderful in that field, sequencing field, just everybody shares all their data. It's amazing. It's not a problem. And you're just absolutely expected to share it in the NCBI databases. There's this great database, if you ever worked on neuronal morphology, called neuromorpho.org. They are the most proactive database in the world. They will actually email you if you've published a paper that involves morphological reconstructions of neurons, and they'll say, can we have your data, please? And they'll actually look after it for you. They'll take it in whatever format you generated it, and they'll put it on their website. But they will also, I think I'm right in saying that they will put it into a kind of common format that all of the morphological reconstructions use on that site. So yeah, that's a really good repository, and you will kind of be expected to contribute to that. They used to have like a name and shame list of people who'd been contacted but hadn't sent them the data. But last time I checked their website, they didn't have that. So maybe they've stopped being that militant, but even so, they do a really good proactive approach. There are other kind of more accessible places where you can share whatever kind of data that you want to share. You're not necessarily expected to share particular types of data here, but they're just essentially repositories that will allow you to deposit your data and make them publicly available. And others are available. These are just some that we've used. And this is just an example of some of our in vivo data, or a data set that included some in vivo data that we shared a few years ago. And what you get when you do this is that you get a DOI, you get a digital object identifier, which comes with your data set itself. This is completely tied to that. So long-term, people can always find the data. It's directly linked to the paper that it comes from. So this is the paper that we published, and it's completely linked to the data on the data sharing website, but also in the paper itself, you have a data availability statement or a section which says the data are all here at this particular place. So it's kind of linked to the paper in a really easily accessible way. You also get some metrics, which is really nice to see what people have been doing, whether they've been downloading or citing. We've had one citation of this database. I checked what it was. It was actually us. It was that paper that directly cited the data. So, we haven't had anyone use it and cite it yet, but, here's hoping. And then you get a kind of list of, the kind of data that's there. We do it figure by figure. So we put our stuff in depending on which figures we've done. And note down here, there's one thing I just wanted to say is that, this wasn't a huge in vivo imaging. It was a 2-photon calcium imaging paper, or 2 figures out of the paper. It wasn't that much imaging, I have to say, compared to some of the studies that are out there. And we still had to break it up into 2 folders on this server. So I think it's a big deal. I've spoken to some people involved in vivo work where they've just got terabytes of data. I think at that point, you might have to have a long, hard think about whether you want to definitely share all of the raw data that's gone into the work. And if so, how you're going to be able to do that. I think there are people who can help you with that if you want to. But maybe it might be time to think, well, what's the kind of direct data that's maybe led to particular figures or particular example images or example movies, or at least things like that that people can work from. Might be a kind of halfway house, but not completely taking up huge amounts of data storage with these kind of things. There's also the license that comes along, so it tells people what they can do with it. And we always publish on a CC BY license so that people can use the data for whatever they want to use it for, as long as they credit us. Okay, and this is a more recent one. And the reason why I put this up, this is from a paper last year, and we switched provider. That was mainly because our institution, King's, has an agreement with that provider to make sure that we don't have to pay for this. So check to see whether your institution also has an agreement with a data sharing repository, because actually it's really, really easy to get this working, and we didn't have to pay anything up front, get anything reimbursed or anything like that. It was a very simple process, very helpful people at the King's Library Service, and the library services are normally the people to go to chat about these things. They can be super, super helpful on that. And one last thing on this is that we found that you can actually kind of place hold a data set DOI. So you can go in there even before you're ready to share your data. Let's say at the point where you're writing your paper, you can go in and say, I'm going to share this data. And so can you generate a DOI for me? And it will do that and kind of hold it in place. You can put that DOI in your manuscript so that it's got the correct DOI when it comes to be published eventually, but you don't necessarily have to release the data at exactly the same time that you're writing or publishing your manuscript. So I think that really helps. going to go fast because I realize I've waffled a bit. Main thing here is that you've got to get people to help you. There's no way one person can sift through all this stuff. Science is teamwork, data sharing is teamwork too. These wonderful people that I've had the pleasure of working with over the last few years have been instrumental in allowing us to get the data to the point where we've been able to share them, especially these guys over here who worked really hard on that most recent data set that I showed you. And just some other things is that I think you need to be not only in a good team, but also in the point where you have planned ahead a little bit. And the earlier you can start planning these things, the better. Especially setting expectations. I mean, it's probably the worst thing if you come along to somebody and you go, right, we're going to share all our data. So I need you to get on that now. And they have no idea, and they've got stuff, or, you know, you should have your data well organized, but it can be quite tricky to bring it all together. If you know from the start of a project that this is what is expected at the end of it, when you publish, you're going to make the data available. You can make sure you've got things in accessible places, and you can do that more easily. Collaborators too, I say this every time, and I forget it myself. So you sort of launch a collaboration, yeah, let's try this. And I always kind of say to myself, yeah, we should talk about data sharing, because you don't want to get to the point where you publish something together and they're like, oh, we don't want to put that out. So it's always a really good idea to try and get people on board and at least convince them that it's a good idea to join you in sharing your data as early as possible. Definitely decide what you're going to share. I think some people data share and it's really just, you know, a little Excel plot, and it's what you put in a graph in figure 4.3. Okay, it lets people go in and check the stats. And I think that's useful, and it's definitely better than sharing nothing. But I think it's more useful to have the actual raw data that went into the experiments that's available to people. So that's what we aim for, but I do recognize that's not always easy or possible. You might want to think about the format that you share things in. There are certain readily shareable formats that you can transform your data into. You can do that. We don't do that. We've never done that. And I think maybe we should at least think about it, because it does make it easier for people to access them later on. But again, it's a question of trade-off with time and effort. And the same thing with this. So if you want to really go to town, and if you look at the FAIR principles for sharing data, I mean, they are great, but they are very, there's a lot of expectation there. One of the things is they want amazing metadata so that not just humans, but any kind of program can come in and like sift through your data and figure out what's what. I mean, that's wonderful. It's a great goal to have. And if you can spend the time to really curate your data and provide enough information that not just a sensible human, but actually an algorithm can find what it needs in your data, then, well, you're doing a brilliant job and well done. But we do at least try and provide enough information that, you know, we tell people what form the data are in, where they can find certain things. And finally, yeah, timing, doing it at or even before, if you're brilliantly organized, the time of publication is great. But we've published some data sets, you know, up to a kind of year after we've published, just because it's taken so long, especially with COVID. I think that's okay too, and it's certainly better than nothing. All right. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions. And if we run over, that's absolutely fine by me. So yeah, I realize I spoke for a bit longer than I should have done. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Matt. That was very informative, and it was the perfect follow-up to Caitlin's talk last week, where she spoke about what you do when you're collecting your data to make sure it's robust. So this next stage in terms of sharing, I think, is really useful. Right. We don't have a huge amount of time, so we've got a question already in the Q&A box. Others, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. So the first question is from Melina Christina. It's actually a question for both of us. It said, is there a worry that shared data that is then used by multiple papers can introduce bias towards a particular data set somewhere downstream in the scientific process? For example, in a systematic review, how do people doing systematic review process multiple papers drawing from the same data set? Thanks, wow. And thanks for the talk.
That is a really, really good question, and I'm very glad Emily's here, because maybe you can answer. It's actually, having not done any kind of meta-analysis myself, I think that's a really important question. I would hope that separate analyses would be valuable as at least additional data, but how you kind of go and weight those within a meta-analysis to say, well, yeah, these are two analyses, but they've come from the same study. And are there ways to do that, Emily? I mean,
so yeah, so we wouldn't. So essentially, each data source can only be in a systematic review or meta-analysis once. So each animal or human, because it will skew your data. So, I mean, we've not, because data sharing isn't the norm or the standard, you know, there's lots of, there's not a lot of data that we get, raw data that we put into systematic reviews. But we have come across where people essentially salami slice the same data or duplicate publications.
Right.
And you can normally just spot it when you have all your data. You know, if you rank your data, you can see the same effect size and variance, and then you go back and you do some investigation, and then you end up essentially having to exclude even one of those. So yeah, but it's a really good point, and I think it's something that we need to have some sort of.
But I wouldn't say, I mean, would there be a big difference? You know, let's say you just had a data set of some people, and one study measured their height and another study measured their weight. So you'd still be able to draw those two papers together, would you not?
Yeah, so yeah, well, it depends on what the question is in your systematic review. Because if your outcome of interest is weight, then you'd only take one. If it's weight or height, you would then pull those data together to get a single metric. Of overall weight and height, and then that's what you would use in your meta-analysis. But you wouldn't have two, because you have to have independent data points. So you wouldn't treat the same animal as two independent data points, because that would violate your assumptions. But yeah, it's a very good question, and I think we definitely do need mechanisms to make sure that we can catch that going forward as we start to share more data.
Thank you. Next one. Oh, Emily, you're going to read, aren't you? Yeah.
Yeah, just so that everyone else can see what we're answering. So do you have any advice for how to tidy data before sharing, rather than sharing tens or hundreds of raw data files? Do you group the data in some way before sharing, or do you keep all the files separate? Yeah,
we try and do this. So we, and I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but this works for us. We link everything to figures in the paper. So we share on a paper by paper basis, and we make one data set per paper, and we try and keep all of the data from that paper together. And so, I mean, maybe a caveat to that is with kind of genomics data, where often it's the same data set that you're then analyzing in multiple figures. But in more of the other kind of cellular molecular stuff we do, it's different data sets per figure. And we organize it like that. And actually the repository that we use now, Figshare, enables you to deposit individual folders for each figure. And then within that, what we normally do is, if we've got a comparison, you know, we're comparing data across two groups, we will normally have a subfolder for each of those groups, so that then you've got the raw data traces. So it's a little bit organized for people. I mean, that's normally the way that we've organized it anyway. So yeah, we try not to just have like this enormous set of hundreds and hundreds of files. There's certainly for our sanity, then that's the way that we've organized it. That's the way we put it out as well. And it does really help actually if you don't have to download the entire data set, and you can just say, I just want those from that figure. That's a nice way to make it more usable too.
I was interested when you were talking about data per figure, and I think what you're saying makes sense, but I guess it also depends on what the purpose is, because you can see, so data descriptor articles are a type of article that some journals are making available, which essentially you put in really detailed methods about how you collect your data, and it's about sharing all the data that you made available to kind of get to the bonus science points that you were making when you were speaking. So I guess in that scenario, you can see how then you would go to efforts to make all the data available. But I think that's a different type of context to the underlying data supporting a paper, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Yeah, you talk about stuff that we might have done as kind of pilot studies, or just like getting things to work, and then we haven't included that. I mean, we don't include that. We only include like the stuff that we thought was of sufficient quality to go into a publication. So yeah, there is still other stuff that's around.
Yeah. I think we, if you think about all the 101 different ways that people collect data, and how you use and what you choose to publish, and how you make that available, then yeah, you can see how, depending on the purpose, how you might do it might be slightly different. But no, what you're saying definitely makes sense. Okay, I think this will be our last question from Joachim. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Great talk, thanks a lot. Talking about planning ahead, are there any particular data management plan tools you would recommend for this? Sorry, I had to think what DMP stood for there.
Do you know what? I don't have any recommendations. I would love to know if there's anybody out there who does, because we've just kind of been, feeling our way into this. And no, I would love to know if there's any software that can actually help you do that. I try and the only kind of tools I have are my own enthusiasm, in the sense that I just kind of try and remind people, well, that's great. We've wrapped up that result. That's going to go into this figure. And yeah, get the data together, because otherwise it's going to make it really hard at the end. I mean, just me kind of constantly reminding people, I guess, is about the only tool that I have. But if there are things out there that would make those kind of planning events easier, then I'd love to know about them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. No, I don't know of any either, to be honest. Okay, all right, I'm going to wrap things up here. Firstly, say a big thank you to you, Matt, for sharing your experience and your insights. Thanks to everybody who joined us this afternoon. We're really grateful for your time. As I said, we have a whole series of these webinars, so please do go and have a look at them. Especially if you were interested in maths today, the one from last week I think is a really nice precursor in terms of some practical tools to help in terms of getting your data in good shape so that you can share it and be confident in sharing it. Matt also mentioned that the BNA has released some, or now has some credibility bursaries for postgraduates and early career researchers. So if you fall into that category, or you have colleagues who you think would benefit from these bursaries, and have a look at the website. They're to support in-person attendance to events to help strengthen the credibility of your work. So as we start to see each other more in real life again, please do make use of that. This is the final in the series for the immediate future anyway. But if there are any other topics or specific points that you're interested in and you'd like more of these, and please do get in touch with the BNA, either via their website or Twitter, or however it is that people communicate these days, and let us know. And with that, I thank you all for your time.